The ballroom fell silent the moment Duke Alistair Blackwood raised his glass, but it was not silence that gripped him. It was the sound cutting through it a heartbeat later, a laugh, bright, unguarded, and completely wrong for the room. He turned his head before he could stop himself. Every other person in the grand hall of Whitmore House stood frozen in practiced elegance, waiting for him to finish the toast that would bind his name to Lady Camilla Whitmore's for the rest of his life. 50 pairs of eyes were fixed on him. But his own eyes had already left the crowd and found the one person who was not looking at him at all. She stood near the tall windows at the far end of the room, half hidden behind a cluster of potted ferns, laughing at something a young footman had whispered while refilling a tray of glasses. She pressed a gloved hand to her mouth, too late to catch the sound. Her shoulders shook, her eyes crinkled at the corners. She looked, for one impossible moment, like the only person in the entire house who was actually alive. Alistair forced his attention back to the glass in his hand, and the woman standing beside him. Lady Camilla Whitmore was, by every measure society valued, perfect. Her hair was arranged in flawless curls. Her gown was the exact shade of blue that flattered her complexion without appearing showy. Her smile was serene, practiced, and utterly without warmth. She had worn that same smile since the negotiations began 4 months ago, and Alistair had never once seen it slip. "To the future Duchess of Ashcombe," he said, lifting his glass higher. The words felt like stones in his mouth. The room erupted in polite applause. Camilla inclined her head with perfect grace, accepting the toast as though it were no more remarkable than the weather. Somewhere behind the ferns, the laughter had already stopped, swallowed back into whatever quiet corner it had come from. Alistair drank, and the wine tasted like nothing at all. He was 28 years old, and he had known since he was 22 that he would marry for money rather than affection. His father had made certain of that. The old Duke had spent the family fortune on failed investments, reckless wagers, and a stubborn refusal to admit that the estate could no longer support the life he insisted on living. By the time he died, 3 years passed. He had left behind a title heavy with debt, and tenants who depended on land that could barely support them anymore. Camilla Whitmore's family had money. Her father, a wealthy merchant who had bought his way into gentility, wanted nothing more than to see his daughter become a duchess. It was, on paper, the perfect solution. Alistair would save his estate and his people. Camilla would gain the title her father craved. Neither of them expected love. Neither of them had asked for it. It should have been simple. He glanced again toward the ferns, though he told himself he would not. She was gone. In her place stood only the footman, straightening his tray, and trying not to look as though he had just been caught laughing with someone above his station. "You seem distracted, Your Grace." Alistair turned to find Camilla's mother, Lady Whitmore, watching him with the sharp attention of a woman who missed very little. She was shorter than her daughter, with quick eyes and a smile that never quite reached them either. "Merely tired," he said. "The negotiations have been long." "They have," she agreed, though her tone suggested she did not entirely believe him, "but nearly finished. My husband hopes to have the settlement papers signed within the fortnight. As do I." "Good." She studied him a moment longer, then added, almost carelessly, "You were looking at something, a moment ago, or someone." Alistair kept his expression still. It was a skill he had practiced since childhood, ever since he learned that showing weakness in front of his father invited only cruelty. "I was admiring the room." "Your husband has excellent taste." Lady Whitmore's smile sharpened slightly, but she let the subject drop. "He will be pleased to hear it." She moved away to attend to other guests, and Alistair allowed himself to breathe again. He had not lied. Exactly. He had simply chosen which truth to share. He found himself wandering toward the edge of the room sometime later, ostensibly to escape the heat of so many candles and so many bodies pressed into one space. The terrace doors stood open, letting in the cool night air, and he stepped through them gratefully, glad for a moment of solitude. He was not alone for long. "You looked as though you were being chased by wolves in there." He turned. She stood a few feet away, near the stone railing, her gloved hands resting lightly on the cold surface. Up close, she was not conventionally beautiful in the way Camilla was. Her nose had a slight curve to it, her chin was a touch too stubborn, and there was a small scar above her left eyebrow that no amount of careful arrangement could hide. But her eyes were a clear, warm brown, and they were looking at him now with open curiosity rather than the careful calculation he had grown used to. "I was not aware I had an audience," he said. "You didn't. I simply have excellent timing." She turned back toward the garden below, apparently unbothered by the fact that she was addressing a duke without introduction or permission. It's a lovely party. Terribly dull, but lovely. Alistair felt the corner of his mouth twitch, an unfamiliar sensation after a night of careful composure. You find your own engagement celebration dull? She glanced at him, confusion flickering across her face for half a second, before understanding dawned, and with it, unmistakable amusement. Oh heavens no. I'm not the bride. I'm quite certain you'd have noticed if I were standing at the front of the room instead of hiding behind the ferns. You were hiding. I was observing. There's a difference. She said it with such conviction that he almost believed her. Though I suppose observing from behind large plants does resemble hiding, now that you mention it. And what were you observing? You, mostly. She said it without embarrassment, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to admit. You gave a toast like a man reading his own sentence. I found it fascinating. Alistair should have ended the conversation there. He should have made some polite excuse and returned to the ballroom, to Camilla, to the life he had already chosen for himself. Instead, he found himself asking, "And who are you, to study strangers so closely?" "Nora Ashford," she said, extending a gloved hand as though they were equals meeting at a country assembly rather than a duke and an uninvited stranger on a terrace. Cousin to the bride, companion to her mother, and generally regarded as the least interesting person at any gathering I attend. Which suits me fine. It leaves me free to watch everyone else. He took her hand, more out of habit than intention, and found her grip firm and unhesitating. Alistair Blackwood. I know who you are, Your Grace. Everyone in that room knows who you are. It's rather the point of tonight. She withdrew her hand and turned back to the garden, and something in her voice shifted, grew quieter. I imagine it's exhausting, being the point of every room you enter. He said nothing, because she was, uncomfortably correct. I won't keep you, she said, before he could decide how to respond. You should return before your absence is noticed. I'm told dukes are not meant to disappear onto terraces during their own engagement parties. And companions are not meant to speak so freely to dukes. No, she agreed, entirely unbothered. But I've never been particularly good at doing what I'm meant to do. Good evening, Your Grace. She left him there, walking back into the light and noise of the ballroom with a lightness in her step that he had not seen in another person all night. He stood alone on the terrace for a long moment, staring at the space where she had been, and told himself firmly that the strange, unsettled feeling in his chest was nothing more than the wine. He did not entirely believe himself. When he returned to the ballroom, Camilla was waiting near the refreshment table, her expression composed as always. There you are. I was beginning to wonder if you'd fled the country. Merely taking some air, he said. Understandable. It is rather warm in here. She studied him for a moment, the way her mother had, though with less suspicion and more polite disinterest. My cousin Nora tends to wander off as well. I hope she did not trouble you. Something in his chest tightened at the casual way she said the name, as though Nora were a minor inconvenience to be apologized for. She did not trouble me at all. Good. Camilla's attention had already drifted to a passing guest, some minor lord she needed to greet, and she excused herself with a small nod, leaving Alistair alone once more in the middle of a room full of people who all wanted something from him. He found his gaze drifting through the crowd, searching, though he told himself he was not searching for anything in particular. When he finally found her, across the room, deep in quiet conversation with an elderly aunt, she was not laughing anymore. But there was still something in the way she held herself, some private amusement dancing behind her eyes, that made her entirely unlike anyone else in the room. He looked away before she could catch him watching. The rest of the evening passed in the usual blur of introductions and small talk, of Lord Whitmore's booming voice as he toasted the match a second time, of Camilla's mother watching every exchange with careful, assessing eyes. Alistair played his part well. He always did. He had spent his entire life learning to say the right words, hold the right expression, give nothing away. But later, long after the carriages had carried the last guests home and he sat alone in his study with a glass of brandy he did not really want, he found himself thinking not of Camilla, or the settlement papers, or the debts that had brought him to this marriage in the first place. He thought of a laugh that had cut through a silent room like sunlight through cloud, and a pair of brown eyes that had looked at him not as a title or a fortune, but as a man exhausted by the weight of his own life. It meant nothing, he told himself. A pleasant conversation on a terrace, nothing more. He drained his glass and told himself the same thing 3 more times before he finally believed it enough to sleep. He did not dream of Camilla that night. He dreamed of laughter behind ferns, and eyes that saw too much, and a voice that had called him exhausted with more honesty than anyone had shown him in years. In the morning, he told himself firmly that it changed nothing. He rose early, as he always did, and stood at the window of his bedchamber looking out over the grounds of Ashcombe, the estate his family had held for 6 generations. The lawns needed tending. The east wing needed a new roof before winter arrived in earnest. These were the things that mattered, he reminded himself. Not a stranger's laugh, not a pair of eyes that had seen straight through him in the space of a single conversation. He dressed, ate a solitary breakfast, and rode out to inspect the tenant farms, as he did most mornings when he was not required in town. The work grounded him. It reminded him why he had agreed to this marriage in the first place, why the settlement papers waiting to be signed mattered more than any fleeting feeling stirred by a stranger on a terrace. But that evening, as he sat once more with his brandy and his ledgers, he found his mind wandering back to the terrace, to the sound of her voice, to the easy way she had spoken to him as though he were simply a man and not a title to be won. He was wrong to think it changed nothing. He simply did not yet understand how wrong. The glove lay in the grass at the edge of the rose garden, pale gray against the green, and Alistair told himself he had simply noticed it by chance. He told himself the same thing 3 days in a row, each time he found some reason to walk the gardens of Whitmore House during the hour when he knew the household typically took its morning air. He had not planned to see her again so soon. The settlement negotiations did not require his presence at Whitmore House more than once a week, and even then, only for an hour or two of discussion with Lord Whitmore and his solicitors. But somehow, in the days since the engagement party, he had found himself accepting every invitation extended by the family, however minor, however unnecessary his attendance truly was. He picked up the glove and turned it over in his hands. It was well made but plain, the kind of glove a companion might own rather than an heiress. He knew, with a certainty he could not explain, exactly whose it was. "You found it." He turned. Nora stood a few feet away, dressed simply in pale green. A basket of cut flowers balanced on one hip. She looked entirely unsurprised to find him standing in the middle of the rose garden holding her glove. "I did," he said, "though I confess I'm not certain how you managed to lose only one. A remarkable talent of mine. I once arrived at church wearing 2 different shoes, and did not notice until the sermon was half finished." She set down her basket and crossed the distance between them, holding out her hand for the glove. "Thank you, Your Grace. Most men would have simply left it in the grass. Most men are not currently negotiating a marriage settlement with your uncle, and therefore have less reason to be wandering his gardens at this particular hour." Something flickered across her face, there and gone too quickly to name. "Ah, yes. I had nearly forgotten the purpose of your visits." "Had you?" For a moment, perhaps. She pulled the glove onto her hand, though her eyes stayed on his. It's easy to forget, when a man is simply standing in a garden holding a glove, that he belongs to someone else entirely. The words landed harder than he expected. He had not thought of himself as belonging to anyone, not truly, not yet, though the papers waiting for his signature would soon make it official in the eyes of the law and of God. "I don't belong to anyone," he said, more sharply than he intended. "Not yet." "No," she agreed quietly. "Not yet." They stood there a moment, the silence stretching between them in a way that felt far too comfortable for 2 people who had spoken only once before. Somewhere behind them, a bird called out from the hedges, and the sound seemed to break whatever spell had settled over the garden. "I should return to my duties," Nora said, picking up her basket. "Lady Whitmore likes her flowers arranged before noon, and I have already wasted a quarter of an hour discussing gloves with the Duke." Was it wasted? She paused, considering the question with more seriousness than he expected. "No," she admitted finally, "though I suspect it should have been." She left him standing among the roses, and Alistair found himself smiling at nothing in particular, an expression so unfamiliar on his own face that he barely recognized the sensation. Over the following weeks, their encounters became less accidental, though neither of them ever acknowledged as much aloud. He found reasons to arrive early for his meetings with Lord Whitmore, knowing she often took her morning walk through the eastern gardens. She in turn began appearing in places he might reasonably expect to find her, always with some perfectly innocent explanation ready. A book that needed returning to the library, flowers that needed cutting, a letter that needed posting in the village, which somehow required a walk down the very lane where he happened to be riding. They spoke of everything and nothing. She had opinions on poetry that made him laugh out loud, actual laughter, the first he had produced in longer than he cared to admit. She thought most romantic poets were entirely too fond of their own suffering, and said so with such conviction that he found himself defending poets he had never particularly cared for, simply to keep the argument going. You only disagree with me because you enjoy watching me get worked up about it, she accused him one afternoon, as they walked along the edge of the pond that bordered the eastern lawn. I disagree with you because Lord Byron was, by all accounts, a genius. Lord Byron was, by all accounts, insufferable. Genius and insufferable are not mutually exclusive, Your Grace. In fact, I suspect they are often the same thing. And which am I in your estimation? Genius or insufferable? She glanced sideways at him, a smile playing at the corner of her mouth. I haven't decided yet. Ask me again in a month. He found himself hoping, with an intensity that startled him, that he would still have the chance to ask her in a month. It was on one such afternoon, walking the same path they had worn nearly smooth over the past weeks, that she finally asked the question he had been dreading. Do you love her? He did not need to ask who she meant. Love is not required for a marriage such as mine. That isn't an answer. No, he admitted, it isn't. Nora stopped walking, and he stopped beside her, though he immediately regretted it, sensing that whatever came next would be difficult to hear. Then what is required? Money, he said simply. My father left the estate buried in debt, tenants who depend on that land for their livelihoods, a roof that leaks in the east wing and a bridge on the northern boundary that collapsed last spring and has not been repaired because there are no funds to repair it. Camilla's family has money. My family has a title. It is, by every practical measure, an excellent match. But not a happy one. Happiness was never part of the arrangement. She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable in a way that unsettled him more than any accusation could have. That seems a very sad way to live, Your Grace. It is the way most people of my station live. You know this as well as I do. I know it, she agreed. I simply never expected to feel sorry for a duke. The words stung more than he expected, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He had never allowed himself to feel sorry for his own circumstances, had trained himself instead to see the marriage as a solution rather than a sacrifice. But standing beside her, hearing his own life described with such plain sympathy, he felt for the first time the full weight of what he was giving up. You pity me, he said. No. She shook her head, and something in her voice softened. I understand you. There's a difference. I have no fortune of my own, no family name worth mentioning, nothing to offer any man beyond myself. I understand very well what it means to have your worth measured by things that have nothing to do with who you actually are. You have never struck me as a woman lacking in worth. Because you've only known me a few weeks, and I've been on my very best behavior. A ghost of her usual humor returned to her voice, though it did not quite reach her eyes. Give it time, Your Grace. I'm sure I'll disappoint you eventually. Everyone does in the end. I doubt that very much. Something passed between them then, unspoken but unmistakable, and for a long moment neither of them moved to break it. It was Nora who finally looked away, busying herself with straightening a fold in her sleeve that did not need straightening. We should not be having this conversation, she said quietly. No, he agreed. We should not. Neither of them moved to end it. Tell me something true, she said suddenly, breaking the silence between them. Something you have never told anyone else. Loom. He considered the request for a long moment, surprised by how much he wanted to answer honestly. I hated my father, he said finally. Everyone believes I mourn him still, that I carry his memory with the proper grief a son owes his parent. But the truth is I felt nothing but relief when he died. Relief and anger, because he left me nothing but debts and a title I never wanted in the way he wanted it for me. Nora did not flinch from the confession, did not offer the polite platitudes he had expected. That is not a shameful thing to feel. It feels shameful. Grief is complicated, Your Grace. A man can hate his father and still wish, somewhere beneath the hatred, that things had been different. The two are not opposites. They live together, most of the time, whether we wish them to or not. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and wondered how a woman with so little claim to worldly wisdom had come to understand him so completely in the space of a single conversation. Your turn, he said. Tell me something true. She was quiet for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the pond, where a pair of swans glided in slow, unhurried circles. I am afraid, she said finally, that I will spend my entire life as someone's companion, someone's cousin, someone's convenient extra pair of hands, and never once be the person anyone chooses simply because they want me. I have made my peace with it mostly, but some nights it is a hard peace to keep. The confession settled between them, heavy and honest in a way that neither poetry nor careless banter had managed to achieve in all their previous conversations. Alistair found himself wanting, with a fierceness that startled him, to tell her that he would choose her, that given the freedom to want anything at all, he would want exactly this, exactly her, standing beside a pond in the fading afternoon light, with swans circling slowly nearby. He said nothing. There was nothing he could say that would not be a promise he had no right to make. They spoke instead of smaller things, safer things, the kind of conversation two strangers might have at a garden party rather than two people who had somehow, over the course of a few short weeks, become something neither of them had a name for. But even as they spoke of poetry and weather and the ridiculous hat Lord Whitmore had worn to church the previous Sunday, Alistair found himself unable to shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between them, something that could not easily be undone. That evening, riding back to Ashcombe beneath a sky heavy with the promise of rain, he found himself thinking not of the settlement papers waiting for his signature, nor of Camilla's careful smile, nor even of the debts that had brought him to this arrangement in the first place. He thought only of brown eyes that saw too much, and a laugh that had first caught his attention across a silent ballroom, and a growing, uncomfortable certainty that he had made a terrible mistake in choosing a bride before he had ever truly known what it felt like to want someone. The rain began just as he reached the gates of Ashcombe, cold and sudden, soaking through his coat before he could reach the stables. He did not hurry to escape it. He stood for a long moment in the downpour, letting the cold clear his head, and told himself firmly that whatever he felt for Nora Ashford was nothing more than a passing fascination, the kind of feeling that would fade once the wedding was finally behind him. He did not believe himself even as he thought it. Inside, a letter waited for him on his desk, sealed with Lord Whitmore's mark. He broke the seal with cold, unsteady fingers and read the contents twice before the meaning fully settled over him. The wedding date had been moved forward. Lord Whitmore, eager to see the match secured before any complications could arise, wished to see the ceremony take place within 6 weeks rather than the 3 months originally agreed upon. Alistair sat down heavily in his chair, the letter still clutched in his hand, and stared into the fire until the flames burned low and the rain outside finally stopped. 6 weeks. He had 6 weeks to marry a woman he did not love, to save an estate that depended entirely on his ability to do so, and to somehow forget the sound of a laugh that had already, without his permission, begun to change everything he thought he knew about what he wanted from his own life. He did not sleep that night. He sat instead by the dying fire, turning the letter over in his hands, and thought of gray gloves left carelessly in green grass, and eyes that understood him better after a few short weeks than Camilla had managed in 4 months of careful courtship. 6 weeks was not very long at all, and yet it suddenly felt like the longest stretch of time he had ever faced. He rose before dawn, unable to bear the stillness of his own chamber a moment longer, and walked the length of his study with the letter still in hand, as though pacing might somehow change the words written upon it. 6 weeks to become a man he did not recognize. 6 weeks to bury whatever had begun to grow in the quiet corners of Whitmore's gardens, before it grew large enough to ruin them both. He thought of writing to Lord Whitmore, of asking for more time, some reasonable excuse involving the estate's accounts or the need for proper preparations. But he knew, even as the thought formed, that more time would change nothing. It would only prolong the ache of wanting something he had already promised away. By the time the sun rose fully over the hills beyond Ashcombe, he had made his decision, or told himself he had. He would honor the agreement. He would marry Camilla Whitmore within 6 weeks, save his estate, save his tenants, and do what dukes had done for generations before him, setting aside personal wants in service of duty. It was, he reminded himself, no different from what his own ancestors had done, no different from what would be expected of his children after him. He told himself this with great conviction, standing alone at his window as the light spread slowly across the frost-covered lawn. He told himself this, and did not believe a single word of it, and rode out that morning toward Whitmore House anyway, unable to stay away even for a single day. Alistair reached Whitmore House to find the front hall in a state of quiet chaos, servants carrying rolls of fine fabric up the staircase, a dressmaker's assistant hurrying past with a box of pins, and Lord Whitmore himself standing in the middle of it all, looking thoroughly pleased with the disruption he had caused. "Your Grace," Lord Whitmore's booming voice carried across the hall the moment he spotted him. "Come to see the preparations already begun, I see. Excellent, excellent. My wife has taken the news of the earlier date rather well, don't you think, given how little notice we've given her?" "Very well indeed," Alistair said, because there was nothing else to say. "Camilla is upstairs with the dressmaker. I dare say she'll want your opinion on the fabric, though between us, Your Grace, I doubt she needs it. The girl has excellent taste." Lord Whitmore clapped him on the shoulder with the easy familiarity of a man who had already spent his daughter's future happiness and considered the transaction entirely satisfactory. 6 weeks, can you believe it? My grandchildren will be born dukes and duchesses before I'm too old to bounce them on my knee. Alistair managed something like a smile and allowed himself to be led toward the stairs, though his eyes swept the hall on the way, searching, as they always did now, for a face that was not Camilla's. He found her an hour later, quite by accident, in the small library at the rear of the house, where he had gone seeking a moment's quiet away from the dressmaker's endless questions about silk and lace. Nora sat curled in a window seat with a book open on her lap, though she did not appear to be reading it. She looked up when he entered, and something in her expression told him she had already heard the news. 6 weeks, she said, before he could speak. You've heard. The entire household has heard. Lady Whitmore has already ordered new curtains for the good drawing room. Apparently the current ones are not fine enough for a duke's wedding breakfast, though they were fine enough for every other occasion in the past decade. She closed her book without marking her place, setting it aside on the window seat. I imagine you came looking for a quiet corner to hide in. I'm afraid I've already claimed this one. I don't mind sharing. She studied him for a long moment, and he saw something shift behind her eyes, a decision being made that he could not quite name. I think, she said slowly, that we should stop finding each other in gardens and libraries, Your Grace. The words landed like a blow, though he had known, somewhere beneath his own stubborn hope, that they were coming eventually. Why? Because in 6 weeks you will be married, and I will still be exactly what I have always been, a cousin, a companion, someone who exists at the edges of other people's lives. And every moment we spend finding quiet corners together makes it harder to remember that when the 6 weeks are finished and you belong entirely to someone else. I don't belong to her, he said, more forcefully than he intended. Not in any way that matters. You will. The law will make certain of it, whether either of us wishes it or not. She rose from the window seat, smoothing her skirts with hands that were not quite steady. I have watched women ruin themselves for less than what is growing between us, Your Grace. I have no fortune, no family name worth protecting, nothing to fall back on if I lose my position here, because of a scandal that was never truly mine to have. I cannot afford to be careless with my own future, even if you can afford to be careless with yours. I have never once been careless with anything in my entire life. No, she agreed, and something softened in her voice despite the firmness of her words. You haven't. Which is exactly why I know you understand what I am saying, even if you don't wish to hear it. She moved toward the door, and every instinct in him screamed to stop her, to say something that would change her mind, though he knew, even as the impulse rose, that he had nothing honest to offer her. He could not promise her anything. He could not undo the settlement papers already half signed, could not erase the debts that made this marriage necessary, could not give her the one thing she deserved most, which was a man free to choose her without consequence. Nora. She paused at the door, her back still to him, her shoulders held with a rigid dignity that told him exactly how much effort it cost her to walk away. I'm sorry, he said, because it was the only true thing he had left to give her. So am I, she said quietly, and then she was gone, leaving him alone in the small library with a book she had not truly been reading, and a silence that felt far heavier than any argument could have. Before he left Whitmore House that afternoon, his steward, a steady, practical man named Edmund Caro who had served the Blackwood family since Alistair was a boy, met him in the courtyard with a bundle of papers under one arm and a look of quiet concern on his weathered face. Your Grace, a moment, if you can spare it. Alistair dismounted and handed his horse's reins to a waiting groom. What is it, Edmund? The Northern Bridge, Your Grace. The one that collapsed in the spring floods. I've had the surveyor look at it again, and I'm afraid the repairs will cost more than we first estimated. Nearly double, if the stonework is to be done properly and not simply patched together to fail again next winter. Alistair rubbed a hand across his face, feeling the weight of the estate settle back onto his shoulders with familiar heaviness. How much more? Edmund named a figure that made Alistair's jaw tighten. I know it is a difficult sum, Your Grace, especially before the wedding is finalized. But the tenants on the northern farms cannot bring their goods to market without that bridge, another season without it, and I fear we will lose several families to neighboring estates that can offer them better access to the roads. We cannot afford to lose tenants. Not now, not with everything else already stretched so thin. No, Your Grace, which is why I wish to speak with you before the wedding, rather than after. Once the settlement is finalized, the funds will flow more freely, but until then, we are managing on very little indeed. Manage as best you can, Edmund. The wedding is 4 weeks away. Once it is done, the bridge will be repaired, the roof on the east wing will finally be seen to, and the tenants will have no cause to look elsewhere for better land. Of course, Your Grace. Edmund hesitated, studying him with the careful attention of a man who had known him since boyhood and could read the weariness beneath his composed exterior better than most. If I may say so, Your Grace, you do not look like a man 4 weeks from his own wedding. I am simply tired, Edmund. The negotiations have been long. As you say, Your Grace. Edmund studied him a moment longer, and something in his expression softened, the careful formality of steward and duke giving way, briefly, to the familiarity of a man who had watched Alistair grow from a boy who feared his own father, to a man who now carried that same father's failures on his shoulders. You know, Your Grace, I served your grandfather before your father, and I have seen a great many marriages arranged for the sake of land and money in my time. Some of them turned out well enough, in their own fashion, others did not. I have never found that the papers signed at the beginning had very much to do with which outcome a man received. Alistair looked at him sharply. What do you mean by that, Edmund? Only that a marriage is a long thing, Your Grace, longer than any settlement, and the terms of it are written as much by the people living it as by the solicitors who draw up the contracts. Edmund did not elaborate further, and Alistair had the distinct impression the older man knew more than he was willing to say aloud, though whether he suspected the truth about Nora or simply spoke from long experience of watching young lords marry for duty rather than affection, Alistair could not tell. He did not press the older man for more, though the words stayed with him long after Edmund had gone, turning over in his mind alongside the figures for the bridge repairs and the weight of everything else pressing down upon him. Edmund did not press further, though his expression suggested he did not entirely believe the explanation any more than Lady Whitmore had, weeks earlier. He gathered his papers and took his leave, and Alistair stood alone in the courtyard for a long moment, feeling the full weight of everything that depended on a marriage he could no longer pretend to want with anything resembling enthusiasm. He rode back toward Ashcombe that evening, turning Edmund's words over in his mind, thinking of the northern farms and the families who depended on land his own father had nearly ruined through carelessness and pride. It would have been easy, once, to think of the marriage as a simple transaction, a fair exchange of title for fortune that troubled no one's conscience. But every mile he rode away from Whitmore House now carried him further from Nora Ashford, and closer to a life he had once accepted without question, and now could not stop questioning at every turn. He did not see her again that day. When he finally returned to the main part of the house, Camilla greeted him with her usual composed smile, showed him a swatch of ivory silk she had chosen for her gown, and asked his opinion on flowers for the ceremony, with the same polite indifference she brought to every conversation between them. He gave whatever answers seemed expected and left as soon as courtesy allowed, riding back to Ashcombe with a heaviness in his chest that no amount of fresh air seemed able to lift. Over the following days, Nora kept her word. She was never in the gardens when he arrived for his meetings with Lord Whitmore. She did not appear in the library, or by the pond, or on any of the paths they had once worn smooth together. He told himself it was for the best, that she had shown more wisdom in a single conversation than he had managed in 6 weeks of increasingly reckless behavior. He told himself this every morning, and found it harder to believe with every passing day. It was nearly 2 weeks before he saw her again, and when he finally did, it was by accident, in the village near Whitmore House, where he had ridden to speak with a solicitor about the final settlement terms. He spotted her outside the village bakery, a basket over one arm, deep in conversation with an elderly woman he did not recognize. She had not seen him yet, and for a moment he simply watched her, struck once more by how completely different she looked from every other woman he knew, how entirely herself she remained even in the smallest, most ordinary moments. She laughed at something the old woman said, and the sound reached him across the narrow village street, familiar now in a way that ached somewhere deep in his chest. It was the same laugh that had first caught his attention across a crowded ballroom, unguarded and honest in a way he had come to understand was simply part of who she was, not a performance meant for anyone's benefit but her own. She spotted him then, and her laughter faded, replaced by something more careful, more guarded. She finished her conversation with the old woman and, rather than avoiding him as he half expected, walked directly toward him. "Your Grace," she said, with a formality that felt like a wall being built between them, brick by careful brick. "Miss Ashford. I did not expect to see you in the village. Nor I you." He glanced at the basket over her arm, grateful for something to focus on besides the ache of standing so close to her again after 2 weeks of careful distance. "Errands for Lady Whitmore?" "Bread for the household, and a visit to Mrs. Colby, who has been unwell." She shifted the basket slightly, and he noticed her hands were not quite steady, a small betrayal of the composure she was trying so hard to maintain. How does the wedding planning progress? Well enough. There is a great deal of silk involved, and rather less of anything that matters. Something flickered across her face, there and gone too quickly to name, though he thought he recognized it as sympathy, or perhaps something closer to grief. I am sorry to hear it, she said. Though I suspect that is simply the nature of weddings such as yours. I suspect you're right. They stood there a moment, the noise of the village market carrying on around them, oblivious to the careful distance both of them were working so hard to maintain. It would have been so easy, he thought, to close the space between them, to say something honest, to ask her to walk with him the way they once had, along paths that no longer felt safe for either of them to travel. He did none of these things. He had promised her, in his own way, to respect the distance she had asked for, and he intended to keep that promise, however much it cost him. I should return to Whitmore House, she said finally. Lady Whitmore will wonder what has kept me. Of course. She hesitated, as though there were more she wished to say, and for a moment he allowed himself to hope she might say it. But she only nodded, a small, formal gesture entirely unlike the easy warmth he had come to associate with her, and walked away down the narrow street, her basket swinging gently at her side. He watched her go until she disappeared around a corner, and then he stood alone in the middle of the village street for longer than was strictly reasonable, feeling the full weight of everything he had lost in choosing, all those months ago, to secure his estate's future at the expense of his own happiness. That night, he sat once more in his study, staring into a fire that had long since burned down to embers, and forced himself to consider, honestly and without the comfortable excuses he had been offering himself for weeks, exactly what he wanted from the remaining 4 weeks before his wedding. He wanted Nora Ashford, plainly and completely, in a way he had never wanted anything in his entire carefully ordered life. He wanted her laugh, and her honesty, and the particular way she looked at him as though he were simply a man, rather than a title to be won, or a fortune to be secured. He wanted, more than he had ever wanted his father's approval or his estate's salvation, a life in which he was free to choose her without consequence. But wanting something and being free to have it were, he had learned long ago, two entirely different things. His tenants depended on this marriage. His family's name, already weakened by his father's recklessness, depended on it. 4 weeks remained before he would stand before a church full of witnesses and promise his life to a woman he did not love, and no amount of wanting Nora Ashford would change the debts that made such a promise necessary. He drained his glass and told himself, for what felt like the 100th time, that he would find a way to make peace with the choice he had already made. He rose the following morning determined to put the entire matter from his mind, and threw himself into estate business with a focus he had not managed in weeks. He reviewed accounts with Edmund, rode out to inspect the damaged bridge himself, and spent an entire afternoon in correspondence with merchants in town regarding materials for the east wing roof. It was, he told himself, exactly the kind of productive distraction he needed, proof that he could still function as a duke should, regardless of whatever complications had settled into his heart uninvited. But even in the midst of columns of figures and careful negotiations over stone and timber, he found his mind drifting back to the village street, to a basket swinging gently at her side, to the particular way she had said his rank rather than his name, as though reminding herself, as much as him, exactly where the boundaries between them now stood. 4 weeks. He repeated the number to himself throughout the day, as though saying it enough times might make the passage of time feel less like a slow, inevitable ending to something he had never properly allowed himself to begin. 4 weeks until vows spoken before witnesses. 4 weeks until a ring placed on a hand that was not the one he found himself thinking of at every quiet moment. 4 weeks until the life he had always expected to live finally, irrevocably, became the only life available to him. He did not yet know how completely that choice was about to be tested. The invitation had arrived 3 days earlier, requesting his presence at Whitmore House for a small family dinner meant to finalize the guest list for the wedding breakfast. Alistair had expected an evening of tedious discussion over seating arrangements and flower selections, the kind of evening he had endured a dozen times already in the weeks since his engagement. He had not expected to find himself, less than an hour after arriving, standing in the same small library where he had last spoken with Nora 2 weeks earlier, having slipped away from the dinner table under the pretense of retrieving a book he claimed to have promised Lord Whitmore's aunt. He had not expected to find Nora there as well. She looked up from the desk where she had been writing letters, clearly as surprised to see him as he was to see her. For a long moment neither of them spoke, the careful distance they had both maintained for 2 weeks, suddenly, dangerously close to collapsing entirely. "I thought you were at dinner," she said finally. I I needed a moment away from the table. He should have left immediately, should have made some excuse and returned to the dining room before anyone noticed his absence. But his feet remained rooted to the spot, unable to make himself walk away from her a second time. I've missed this room. Have you? I've missed you. The words left him before he could stop them, honest and unguarded in a way he rarely allowed himself to be. I know you asked for distance, and I've tried to give it to you, but 2 weeks has felt like 2 years. Something in her carefully composed expression cracked, just slightly, and for a moment he saw the same longing in her eyes that had been building in his own chest since the day she walked away from him in this very room. It has felt long for me as well, she admitted quietly. He crossed the room before he could think better of it, closing the distance between them until he stood only a few feet away. Nora. Don't, she said, though the word carried little conviction. Please, Alistair, if you say what I think you're about to say, I don't know that I'll have the strength to walk away from it a second time. Her use of his given name, the first time she had ever spoken it without title or formality, undid something in his chest that had been holding steady for weeks. Then don't walk away. I have to. You know I have to. I know nothing of the sort. He reached for her hand and she did not pull away, though her fingers trembled slightly beneath his own. I have spent 6 weeks trying to convince myself that duty matters more than happiness, that an estate full of debts is worth more than a life spent with someone who actually sees me. I don't believe it anymore, Nora. I haven't believed it since the night I heard you laughing behind those ferns. Alistair. Let me finish. He held her hand more firmly, as though the physical connection might anchor whatever courage had finally allowed him to say the things he had been thinking for weeks. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to save my tenants and my estate without Camilla's fortune, and I don't know how to face a lifetime without you standing somewhere in it. But I know that whatever I feel for you is more real than anything I have ever felt for anyone else, and I am tired of pretending otherwise. For a moment she said nothing, simply looked at him with an expression that held equal parts hope and fear, as though she wanted desperately to believe him but had learned, through long practice, not to trust such declarations too easily. What are you asking of me? She said finally. Before he could answer, the door to the library opened, and Camilla stood in the frame, her composed expression faltering for the first time since he had known her. The silence that followed felt endless. Alistair released Nora's hand too late to make the gesture look innocent, and Camilla's eyes moved between them with a coldness that told him she understood exactly what she had walked in on. I wondered where you had gone, Camilla said, her voice carefully controlled despite the tightness around her eyes. The footman said you'd gone looking for a book. I did not realize you required my cousin's assistance in locating one. Camilla. Don't. She held up a hand, cutting him off with a sharpness he had never heard from her before. Please don't insult me with an explanation, Your Grace. I may not love you, but I am not a fool. Nora had gone pale, her hand pressed against the desk as though she needed the support to remain standing. Camilla, I never intended. I don't particularly care what you intended, Nora. Camilla's voice remained cold, though there was something beneath the anger that sounded almost like exhaustion. I have known for weeks that something was different. The way he looks for you in every room, the way you disappear whenever he is expected to visit. I told myself I was imagining it, because it was easier than admitting the truth. Camilla, please. Alistair started, but she cut him off again, this time turning her full attention on him. Do you know what I find most insulting, Your Grace? Not that you have feelings for another woman. I never expected love from this marriage any more than you did. What insults me is that you allowed me to believe this was a partnership between equals, two people making the same practical bargain for the same practical reasons, when all along you were falling in love with someone else entirely. I never meant to hurt you. No, she agreed, with a bitterness that surprised him. I don't suppose you did. You simply meant to have both things, didn't you? My fortune and her affection. A convenient wife and a woman you actually wanted. Men of your station seem to believe they are entitled to both. The accusation landed harder than he expected, not because it was entirely fair, but because some part of it held an uncomfortable truth. He had wanted to keep the arrangement with Camilla intact while allowing whatever grew between himself and Nora to continue unchecked. Had told himself for weeks that he could somehow manage both without consequence. You're right, he said quietly. It was wrong of me to let this continue without being honest with you. Camilla's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise at his admission, though it did not soften her tone. Yes, it was. She turned her attention back to Nora, and her voice, when she spoke again, had lost some of its heat, replaced by something colder and more calculating. As for you, cousin, I would think carefully about what you believe you are gaining here. A duke's affection is a lovely thing to imagine, but it will not put food on your table or a roof over your head if this marriage falls apart and his estate collapses under its debts. You have no fortune, no name, nothing to offer him beyond feelings that will not survive a single hard winter. Camilla, that's enough, Alistair said sharply. Is it? Camilla's eyes moved between them one final time, and whatever softness had briefly appeared in her expression vanished entirely. I think I have said exactly enough, Your Grace. The wedding is in 4 weeks. I suggest you decide before then exactly which bargain you intend to honor. My father will not take kindly to a broken engagement, and neither, I imagine, will the tenants whose future depends on my fortune. She left them standing in the library, her footsteps echoing sharply down the hallway, and the silence she left behind felt heavier than anything that had passed between Alistair and Nora in all their weeks of careful, forbidden conversation. She's right, Nora said finally, breaking the silence. About all of it. Nora. No, Alistair, listen to me. She pulled her hand free of his, though there was no anger in the gesture, only a weary resignation that frightened him more than any argument could have. I have no fortune. I have no name worth mentioning. If you break this engagement for me, you risk everything. Your estate, your tenants, your family's future, all for a woman who can offer you nothing in return except feelings that, however real, will not repair a single bridge or fix a single leaking roof. I don't care about the bridge or the roof. You will, she said quietly. When your tenants lose their homes because you chose feelings over duty, you will care very much, and you will resent me for it, whether you mean to or not. I would never resent you. You don't know that, neither do I. She moved past him toward the door, and this time, he did not try to stop her, some part of him recognizing that whatever she needed to say it without his hands holding her in place. I think it would be best if I left Whitmore House, Alistair, before this goes any further. Before it costs you everything you have worked so hard to save. Nora, please. But she was already gone, leaving him alone once more in the small library, surrounded by books she had not truly been reading, and a silence that felt, this time, like the beginning of an ending, rather than merely a pause. He stood there for a long time, staring at the door she had closed quietly behind her, before finally forcing himself to return to the dining room, where the remaining guests had already moved on to dessert, apparently unaware of the storm that had just passed through the library down the hall. Lord Whitmore greeted him with his usual booming warmth, asking after his opinion on the wine, and Alistair answered with whatever words seemed expected, though he could not have said afterward what he had eaten or what conversation had passed around the table for the remainder of the evening. Camilla did not return to dinner. Lady Whitmore made some brief excuse about a headache, and if any of the other guests suspected the true cause of her absence, they were too polite to say so aloud. Alistair excused himself as soon as courtesy allowed, claiming urgent estate business that required his early departure, and rode back toward Ashcombe beneath a sky thick with clouds that threatened rain but never quite delivered it. He did not go directly home. Instead, he found himself riding past the edges of his own land, out toward the northern boundary where the collapsed bridge still lay in ruins, a stark reminder of everything that depended on the marriage he had just thrown into jeopardy. He dismounted near the riverbank and stood for a long while in the darkness, listening to the water rush past the broken stones, and tried to imagine a version of his life in which duty and happiness were not, as Camilla had so bitterly pointed out, entirely at odds with one another. He thought of his tenants, families he had known since childhood, men and women who worked land that his own ancestors had promised to protect in exchange for their labor and loyalty. He thought of old Mrs. Colby in the village, whose roof leaked as badly as his own, and of the northern farmers who could not bring their goods to market without a bridge his estate could not currently afford to repair. He thought of Edmund, who had served 3 generations of Blackwood dukes and deserved, after decades of quiet loyalty, to see the estate finally set right. And he thought of Nora, standing in the library with her hand trembling beneath his own, telling him with quiet, devastating honesty that she would rather leave than watch him ruin himself for her sake. He did not know, standing alone in the darkness beside a broken bridge, which obligation should weigh more heavily upon him. He had spent his entire life being told that duty came before desire, that a man of his station did not have the luxury of choosing happiness over responsibility. He had believed it, mostly, until a laugh behind a cluster of ferns had shown him exactly what he had been missing by living according to rules he had never chosen for himself. By the time he finally returned to Ashcombe, the eastern sky had begun to lighten with the first pale hints of dawn, and he had reached no decision at all, only a bone-deep exhaustion that made every step toward his own front door feel heavier than the last. He fell asleep in his clothes, still dressed for the dinner he had fled hours earlier, and dreamed of a wedding he could not quite picture clearly, the face of the bride shifting between two women he could no longer separate cleanly in his own mind. He woke past noon to find Edmund waiting for him in the study, an unusual visit for that hour, and immediately understood from the older man's expression that the news he carried was not good. "What is it?" Alistair asked, pushing himself upright and reaching for the cup of strong tea Edmund had already poured for him. "A letter arrived this morning, Your Grace, from Lord Whitmore's solicitor. I thought you would wish to see it immediately." Alistair broke the seal with hands that were not quite steady, and read the contents twice before the full weight of the words settled over him. Lord Whitmore, it seemed, had heard some version of the previous evening's events, likely from his own daughter, and wished to remind His Grace, in the coldest and most formal language his solicitor could manage, that the settlement agreement contained specific penalties for any breach of the engagement on the Duke's part. Penalties that would leave the Blackwood estate in a far worse financial position than it currently occupied. "He means to trap me," Alistair said quietly, setting the letter down on his desk with more force than necessary. "He means to protect his daughter and his own investment, Your Grace, though I imagine the two motives feel rather similar from where he sits." Edmund's expression remained carefully neutral, though Alistair suspected the older man had already guessed at more of the situation than he was willing to say aloud. "May I ask, Your Grace, what happened last evening to prompt such a letter?" Alistair considered lying, considered offering some vague explanation about a misunderstanding that had already been resolved, but found he no longer had the energy for careful deception, not with Edmund, who had known him too long and too well to be easily fooled. "I have feelings for someone other than Lady Camilla," he said finally. "Her cousin. Camilla discovered as much last night, quite by accident." Edmund did not appear particularly surprised by the confession, which told Alistair the older man had likely suspected the truth for some time. "And what do you intend to do about it, Your Grace?" "I don't know," Alistair admitted. 3 weeks ago I would have told you my duty was clear. Now I find I can no longer see it clearly at all." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, studying him with the same careful attention he had shown in the courtyard weeks earlier. "Your Grace, if I may offer an old man's observation, duty and happiness are not always as opposed as we are taught to believe. Sometimes the two simply require a man to be more clever and more determined than the easy path allows." "What would you have me do, Edmund? Find some way to save the estate without Camilla's fortune in 3 weeks' time?" "I would have you consider, Your Grace, that a man who has never truly tried to find another way has no right to claim there isn't one." The words stayed with Alistair long after Edmund had gone, turning over in his mind alongside the letter's cold threats and the memory of Nora's trembling hand beneath his own. 3 weeks remained before he would either marry a woman who now hated him or find some other way entirely, some solution he had not yet allowed himself to imagine, that might save both his estate and the only chance at happiness he had ever truly wanted for himself. He stood there for a long time, staring at the door she had closed quietly behind her the night before, and understood, with a clarity that terrified him, that he had just 3 weeks left to decide what kind of man he truly wanted to be. The letter from Lord Whitmore's solicitor was only the beginning. Within days, word of the broken understanding had begun to spread through the county in the particular, unstoppable way that gossip always managed to travel among people with too much leisure and too little to occupy their minds. Alistair heard it first from a neighboring landowner who mentioned, with poorly disguised curiosity, that he had heard the Blackwood wedding was facing some difficulty. He heard it again from his own housekeeper, who reported that the servants had been asking questions she did not know how to answer. By the end of the week, he could no longer pretend the matter remained private. He rode to Whitmore House determined to speak with Lord Whitmore directly, to find some way through the mess that did not involve ruining either his own estate or Nora's reputation. But he arrived to find the household in a state of controlled crisis that made any private conversation nearly impossible. Lady Whitmore was overseeing preparations for a hastily arranged dinner meant, he gathered, to demonstrate to the county that the engagement remained entirely intact. Camilla moved through the preparations with brittle composure, offering him only the coldest of greetings when their paths crossed in the hallway. He found Lord Whitmore in his study, surrounded by papers that Alistair recognized, with a sinking feeling, as the original settlement documents. "Your Grace." Lord Whitmore's usual warmth had cooled considerably since their last meeting, replaced by a careful formality that felt far more dangerous than his previous booming friendliness. "I confess I did not expect to see you before the wedding, given the circumstances. I came to speak with you honestly, Lord Whitmore, about those very circumstances. Honesty. Yes, rather overdue, wouldn't you say? Lord Whitmore gestured toward a chair, though his expression made clear the invitation carried no real warmth behind it. Sit, Your Grace, and tell me exactly what kind of man I have promised my daughter to. Alistair remained standing. I have developed feelings for your niece, Lord Whitmore. I did not intend for it to happen, and I have tried, without success, to set those feelings aside in favor of the arrangement between our families. I owe you honesty rather than continued pretense. Lord Whitmore's jaw tightened, though he did not immediately erupt into the anger Alistair had half expected. You owe my daughter considerably more than honesty, Your Grace. You owe her the marriage you promised, the title you agreed to give her in exchange for the fortune that will save your estate. Do you understand what will happen to your family's name if this engagement collapses now, publicly, after everything has already been announced? I understand it will be difficult. Difficult. Lord Whitmore's laugh held no humor at all. Your Grace, the settlement agreement includes penalties precisely because such difficulties are common among men of your station. If you break this engagement, you forfeit certain properties already pledged against the marriage, properties that represent a significant portion of what remains of your family's holdings. Your tenants, the very people you claim to be protecting through this marriage, will find themselves worse off than if you had never proposed the match at all. The words landed like physical blows, confirming everything Alistair had feared since receiving the solicitor's letter days earlier. And if I honor the engagement despite my feelings for your niece, what then, Lord Whitmore? A marriage built on resentment, to a woman who now despises me, raising children in a household poisoned from its very beginning by a truth we both know but refuse to speak aloud? Then you will have done your duty, Your Grace, which is considerably more than most men manage in this life. Lord Whitmore rose from his desk, moving to the window that overlooked the gardens where Alistair had first found Nora's discarded glove weeks earlier. I built this family's fortune through hard work and careful choices, Your Grace, not through feelings. Feelings are a luxury for men who do not understand what it costs to lose everything. I do not intend to let a passing infatuation destroy the future I have worked my entire life to secure for my daughter. It is not a passing infatuation. It does not matter what it is. Lord Whitmore turned back to face him, and something in his expression, beneath the anger, looked almost like genuine sympathy, though it did nothing to soften his position. You have 3 weeks, Your Grace, to decide whether you intend to honor your obligations or forfeit everything your family has worked for generations to preserve. I would advise you to choose carefully, and quickly, before the entire county decides the choice for you through gossip and speculation that neither family can afford. Alistair left Whitmore House that afternoon without having spoken to Nora at all, though he searched every room he passed for some glimpse of her, some chance to explain what had transpired in Lord Whitmore's study. He did not find her, and when he finally asked a passing servant, quietly, whether Miss Ashford was within the house, the young woman's careful, evasive answer told him everything he needed to know. Nora had left Whitmore House 3 days earlier. He rode back to Ashcombe in a state of barely controlled panic, his mind racing through every possibility of where she might have gone. She had no fortune, no family beyond the distant connection to the Whitmores that had granted her a place in their household in the first place. She had spoken once, weeks earlier, of a small cottage belonging to an aunt on her mother's side, somewhere on the edge of the neighboring county, though she had mentioned it only in passing, as an old memory rather than a present possibility. It took him 2 full days of careful, discreet inquiry to locate her, 2 days during which he barely slept or ate, consumed entirely by the fear that she had disappeared beyond his reach forever. He finally learned, through a letter from an old acquaintance who happened to know the family, that she had indeed gone to her aunt's cottage, a modest but respectable home on the edge of a small village, nearly a full day's ride from Ashcombe. He set out at dawn the following morning, telling Edmund only that he had urgent business that would keep him away for several days, and rode harder than he had in years, driven by a fear that grew heavier with every mile, that he might arrive too late to say the things he should have said weeks earlier, before pride and duty had cost him the chance to say them at all. He reached the village as the sun began to set, exhausted and travel-worn, and found the cottage easily enough with directions from a helpful shopkeeper who seemed unsurprised that a duke had arrived asking after Miss Ashford, as though the entire village had already guessed at some version of the story unfolding. Nora answered the door herself, and the shock on her face when she recognized him told him she had not expected to see him again, certainly not standing on her aunt's doorstep, still dressed in travel-stained clothes after a day's hard riding. "Alistair, what are you doing here?" "I came to find you." He was suddenly, acutely aware of how disheveled he must look, how little the moment resembled the careful, composed declarations he had imagined making during 2 sleepless nights of searching for her. I should have come sooner. I should never have let you leave Whitmore House without speaking to you first. I didn't want you to find me." But there was no real conviction in the words, and something in her expression, some flicker of relief beneath the surprise, told him she was not entirely honest in the claim. "May I come in? Or at the very least, may I explain myself before you close this door and I am forced to ride back to Ashcombe having said nothing at all?" She hesitated, glancing back toward the interior of the cottage, where he could see the warm glow of a fire, and hear, faintly, the sound of someone moving about in another room. "My aunt is within. I don't think it would be proper for you to enter." "Then walk with me, just for a few minutes. I have ridden the better part of a day to say what I need to say, and I would rather not do it standing on your doorstep like a man selling ribbons." A ghost of her old humor flickered across her face despite everything, and she stepped outside, closing the door quietly behind her. They walked together toward a small orchard at the edge of the property, the evening air cool and quiet around them, entirely unlike the grand gardens of Whitmore House where they had first begun this careful, complicated dance toward each other. "Lord Whitmore threatened to ruin my family financially if I break the engagement," Alistair said, deciding honesty was the only approach that made sense after everything that had already passed between them. "The settlement includes penalties that would cost me a significant portion of what remains of my estate. My tenants would suffer for it, families who have depended on the Blackwood name for generations." "Then you must honor the engagement," Nora said quietly, though the words seemed to cost her considerable effort. "I told you as much weeks ago, Alistair. I never wanted to be the reason your tenants lost their homes. I know you didn't, and I have spent every hour since Lord Whitmore's threat, trying to find some way through this that does not require choosing between you and them." He stopped walking, turning to face her fully beneath the branches of an old apple tree just beginning to show its first spring blossoms. "I believe I have found it, though it will require more courage than I have shown in this entire affair up to this point." "What do you mean?" "There is a distant relative on my mother's side, a great-uncle who died some years ago, and left behind an unentailed property near the coast, one that has sat empty and largely forgotten because the income it generates seemed too modest to bother with, compared to the main estate. Edmund believes, if we sell it outright rather than continuing to hold it for sentiment's sake, the proceeds combined with a restructured mortgage on the northern farms could cover enough of the immediate debts to make the marriage unnecessary, or at least buy enough time to find a more permanent solution that does not require Camilla's fortune at all." Nora's eyes widened slightly, hope warring visibly with the caution she had built around herself over the past weeks. Would it be enough? Truly enough? Not simply a temporary reprieve that leaves you in the same position a year from now? "I don't know for certain. Edmund believes it is possible, though it will require careful management and considerably more frugality than my family has practiced in a generation. It will mean delaying certain repairs, managing the estate more cautiously than my father ever bothered to do. But it is a chance, Nora, a real chance to choose a different future than the one Lord Whitmore's settlement demands. And Camilla, the engagement? I intend to break it, regardless of the penalties, though I hope this new plan will soften the financial blow considerably. She deserves a husband who wants her for herself, not for her father's fortune, and I have made it entirely clear, through my own carelessness, that I am not that man." He reached for her hand, and this time, she did not hesitate before taking it. "I am done pretending duty and happiness cannot exist in the same life, Nora. I would rather face every difficulty this new path requires than spend a single day married to a woman I do not love, while the woman I do love lives somewhere beyond my reach because I was too afraid to fight for something better." Tears gathered in her eyes, though she blinked them back with the same stubborn composure he had come to know so well over the past weeks. "This is a considerable risk you're describing, Alistair. If Edmund is wrong, if the sale doesn't cover enough, if the tenants suffer despite your best intentions, then I will find another way," he said firmly. "I have spent my entire life believing there was only ever one path available to men in my position, one narrow definition of duty that left no room for anything resembling genuine happiness. I no longer believe that, and I refuse to spend the rest of my life proving myself right about a belief I never truly examined until you forced me to." She was quiet for a long moment, studying him beneath the darkening sky, the first stars beginning to appear above the orchard's blossoming branches. "You rode an entire day to tell me this. I would have ridden considerably further." A smile broke across her face then, the same unguarded, honest smile that had first caught his attention across a crowded ballroom weeks earlier, and the sound of her laughter, when it finally came, felt like the first true breath he had drawn in longer than he could remember. "Then I suppose," she said, "you had better come inside and meet my aunt properly, if you intend to go about ruining both our reputations quite so thoroughly." Her aunt, a kind-faced widow named Margaret Cole, greeted him with far less shock than he had expected, ushering him into a small but comfortable sitting room and insisting he take supper before he attempted the ride back to Ashcombe, given how thoroughly exhausted he appeared after his journey. She asked no immediate questions about his sudden appearance on her doorstep, though the knowing look she exchanged with Nora across the table told him she had likely guessed at the shape of the story, if not every detail. "You'll forgive an old woman's curiosity, Your Grace," Margaret said eventually, once the meal had been cleared and the three of them sat together near the fire. "But my niece arrived here 3 days ago looking as though her heart had been thoroughly broken, and now a duke appears on my doorstep looking rather worse for wear himself, having ridden the better part of a day to find her. I find myself wondering exactly what has happened between the two of you." Nora flushed, though she did not look away from her aunt's steady gaze. "It's a complicated situation, Aunt Margaret. Most interesting situations are." Margaret's eyes moved to Alistair, sharp despite her age. "Do you love my niece, Your Grace?" The directness of the question startled him, though he found he did not hesitate in answering it. "I do, more than I believed myself capable of feeling for anyone." "And does she love you in return?" "I believe so, though she has been considerably more cautious in admitting it than I have been." Margaret's mouth curved into something like approval. "Caution is a sensible quality in a woman with as little to fall back on as my niece has always had. She has spent her entire life learning that affection freely given is rarely returned in equal measure, Your Grace. If you intend to pursue this, you had best be certain you mean to see it through, whatever obstacles your family or hers throws in your path." "I intend to see it through," Alistair said firmly, "whatever it costs me." "Good." Margaret rose from her chair, gathering her shawl about her shoulders with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had raised children and buried a husband, and no longer had patience for lengthy sentiment when a point had already been made clearly enough. "Then I shall leave you two to discuss whatever needs discussing, though I expect you to conduct yourselves properly while I am in the next room, Your Grace, Duke or not." She left them alone by the fire, and for a long while neither of them spoke, simply sitting together in the comfortable quiet, the events of the past week settling slowly into something that finally felt less like chaos, and more like the beginning of a plan. "I should return to Ashcombe tomorrow," Alistair said eventually. "Edmund will need my full attention if we are to make this new arrangement work, and I imagine Lord Whitmore will not take kindly to the news once I've formally broken the engagement. He will be furious, undoubtedly, and Camilla will have every right to her own anger as well, whatever comes of it." He reached for Nora's hand again, grateful when she allowed it without hesitation this time. "I don't know exactly what the coming months will look like, Nora. There will be difficulty, and gossip, and very likely some hardship as the estate adjusts to managing without the fortune I once believed absolutely necessary to its survival." "I am not afraid of hardship, Alistair. I have lived with very little my entire life. I know how to manage on modest means far better than most women of your acquaintance." "I know." He smiled, the first easy, unguarded smile he had allowed himself in weeks. "It is one of the many things I love about you." She laughed then, soft and genuine, and the sound of it filled the small sitting room with a warmth that no amount of silk or fine furnishings at Whitmore House had ever managed to produce. "You should return to your aunt's approval before you say something else that makes me entirely unable to send you back to Ashcombe tonight as propriety demands. Perhaps I don't wish to be sent back quite yet. Perhaps you must be, regardless of what you wish." But she was still smiling as she said it, and when he finally did take his leave that evening, riding back toward the small inn where he intended to spend the night before beginning the long journey home the following morning, he carried with him a lightness he had not felt in longer than he could remember, the first genuine hope that the life he actually wanted might yet be within his reach. Alistair returned to Ashcombe the following afternoon to find Edmund waiting in the study, a fresh stack of papers already prepared on the desk, as though the older man had somehow anticipated exactly what his employer intended to ask of him. "You found her, Your Grace." It was not a question. "I did, and I have made a decision, Edmund, one I hope you'll help me see through, however difficult it proves to be." Alistair crossed to the desk, studying the papers Edmund had prepared, columns of figures relating to the unentailed coastal property his great-uncle had left behind years earlier. "I intend to break the engagement with Lady Camilla. I want to explore the sale of the coastal property, and I want to know, honestly, whether it can be done in time to satisfy the settlement penalties without destroying what remains of the estate." Edmund did not appear surprised, though he studied Alistair carefully before answering, as though wanting to be certain the decision was one that would hold firm under pressure. I have already made some preliminary inquiries, Your Grace, since our conversation the other day. There is interest in the property. A merchant family looking to establish a summer residence near the coast has expressed willingness to pay a fair price, perhaps even above what we might have expected given the property's neglected condition. How much time would we need? If we move quickly, the sale could be finalized within a month. Combined with a restructured mortgage on the northern farms, which I have also begun discussing with the bank in town, I believe we can cover the settlement penalties and still have enough remaining to complete the bridge repairs and the roof on the east wing, though it will require considerable frugality elsewhere for the next several years. Relief flooded through Alistair with an intensity that nearly weakened his knees. Then we proceed, immediately. Yes, Your Grace. Edmund gathered the papers, though he paused before leaving, studying Alistair with an expression that held something close to genuine warmth beneath his usual careful formality. May I say, Your Grace, that your grandfather would have been proud to see you fight this hard for something you actually wanted, rather than simply accepting the path laid out for you by others. It is not a quality I saw often enough in your father. The words settled somewhere deep in Alistair's chest, a small but meaningful comfort after weeks of doubting whether the choice he was making was wisdom or foolishness. Thank you, Edmund, for everything. He rode to Whitmore House the following morning, prepared for the confrontation that awaited him, and found Lord Whitmore already waiting in his study, clearly having anticipated exactly why the Duke had returned so soon after their previous difficult conversation. I assume you've come to tell me you intend to break the engagement, Lord Whitmore said, without preamble, before Alistair had even fully crossed the threshold. I have, and I intend to satisfy the settlement penalties in full, Lord Whitmore, through the sale of a property unconnected to the main estate. I will not ask your family to bear any cost for my own change of heart, and I owe you and Camilla both a sincere apology for the position my indecision has placed you in. Lord Whitmore studied him for a long moment, some of the anger fading from his expression, replaced by something more thoughtful. You found a way to manage the finances then, without my daughter's fortune. I believe so. It will require sacrifice and careful management, but I would rather face those difficulties honestly than build a marriage on convenience, while denying both your daughter and myself the chance at genuine happiness with someone else. And the girl, my niece. Lord Whitmore's tone remained careful, though not unkind. You intend to marry her, once the settlement is resolved? If she'll have me, yes. I intend to ask her properly, once I am free to do so without the shadow of a broken promise hanging over both our heads. Lord Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that made him seem considerably older than he had appeared during their previous, more hostile conversation. I built my fortune through practical choices, Your Grace, and I raised my daughter to make practical choices of her own. I will confess I do not fully understand this modern insistence on marrying for feeling rather than sense, but I have watched my wife and I build a life together over 30 years without much affection between us at the start, and I cannot say it has been an unhappy life exactly, though I sometimes wonder what might have been different had either of us been braver in our youth. I am sorry for the difficulty this has caused your family. Camilla will recover. She is a sensible girl, and I imagine she will find a match considerably better suited to her own temperament than a man whose heart clearly belonged elsewhere from the very beginning. Lord Whitmore extended his hand, a gesture Alistair had not expected but accepted gratefully. Go and speak with my daughter yourself, Your Grace. She deserves that courtesy from you directly, whatever else has passed between us. He found Camilla in the same small library where Nora had once shared her fears with him beneath the quiet afternoon light, and where, weeks later, Camilla herself had discovered the truth that had set this entire chain of events into motion. She looked up when he entered, her expression guarded but no longer carrying the raw anger of their last difficult conversation. I wondered if you would come to say it yourself, or simply send my father to deliver the news. Her voice held less bitterness than he expected, replaced by something closer to resignation. I owed you that much at the very least. You owed me considerably more than that, Your Grace, though I suppose an apology delivered in person is better than none at all. She set aside the book she had been holding, studying him with an appraisal that felt more clinical than emotional. I've had time to think, these past weeks, about what I actually wanted from this marriage. I told myself, when the arrangement was first proposed, that I did not require love, that a title and a comfortable life would be more than sufficient compensation for whatever affection I might otherwise have hoped for. And now? Now I find I am considerably more angry about being deceived than about losing a husband I never truly wanted for myself, beyond the title he offered. A faint, humorless smile crossed her face. "You have done me an unintentional favor, Your Grace, however badly you managed the delivery of it. I am free now to find a match that offers both practicality and genuine affection, rather than settling for the first advantageous offer that presented itself. I hope you find exactly that, Camilla. You deserve considerably better than what I was prepared to offer you." "Yes," she agreed, without malice. "I do." She extended her hand, a small but genuine gesture of goodwill that surprised him after everything that had passed between them. "Go and marry my cousin properly, Your Grace, and treat her considerably better than you treated me during our own brief engagement. She deserves that, at the very least, after everything she has sacrificed to be with you." The following weeks passed in a blur of careful negotiation and quiet relief. Edmund's arrangements proceeded as planned, the coastal property selling for a price that comfortably covered the settlement penalties while leaving enough remaining to begin the long-delayed repairs on the bridge and the east wing roof. The engagement's dissolution caused precisely the gossip Alistair had expected among the county's more idle residents, though it faded considerably faster than he feared, replaced eventually by newer scandals belonging to other families entirely. He rode to Margaret Cole's cottage 3 weeks after their first difficult conversation by the fire, this time with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother tucked carefully into his coat pocket, and found Nora in the small orchard behind the cottage, tending to the apple trees that had just begun to show their first proper blossoms of the season. "You've come back," she said, though there was no surprise in her voice, only quiet pleasure at seeing him again. "I told you I would. I have news, Nora. Good news, for once, after everything else that has happened these past weeks." She listened as he explained everything: the sale of the coastal property, the restructured mortgage, Lord Whitmore's grudging acceptance, and Camilla's surprising, unexpected grace in the face of a broken engagement she had never truly wanted in the first place. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, studying him beneath the blossoming branches with an expression he had come to recognize as the particular way she looked when she was working up the courage to say something honest. "I was afraid," she admitted finally. "These past 3 weeks, waiting to hear whether the plan would actually work, whether you would return with good news, or simply return to tell me the entire arrangement had fallen apart and taken your estate down with it. I know, I am sorry for the waiting, though I believe the outcome was worth the difficulty it cost us both." "Was it?" A teasing note crept into her voice, the first hint of her old humor returning fully after weeks of careful worry. "I suppose I'll reserve judgment until I see exactly what kind of husband a duke who nearly ruined himself for love actually makes." He laughed, genuinely and without restraint, the sound echoing through the quiet orchard in a way that felt like the truest expression of happiness he had managed in longer than he could remember. "Then perhaps you should marry me and find out properly, rather than simply speculating from a distance." Her eyes widened as he sank to one knee among the fallen blossoms scattered across the orchard grass, producing the ring he had carried carefully throughout the entire journey from Ashcombe. "Nora Ashford, I have spent my entire adult life believing duty and happiness could never truly coexist, that a man of my station was required to choose one entirely at the expense of the other. You proved me wrong, though it took considerably longer than it should have for me to understand the lesson properly. I love you, entirely and without reservation, and I would very much like to spend the rest of my life proving that love was worth every risk it cost us both to reach this moment. Will you marry me?" Tears gathered in her eyes, though this time she made no effort to blink them back, allowing them to fall freely as she reached for his hand and pulled him back to his feet. "Yes," she said, laughing even as she wept, the sound bright and unguarded, and entirely, completely her own. "Yes, of course, yes." He kissed her then, beneath the blossoming apple trees, with a happiness that felt entirely earned after everything they had both risked to reach this single, perfect moment. When they finally parted, still holding each other beneath the gentle afternoon light, she looked up at him with an expression of such open, honest joy that he found himself thinking once again of the first time he had heard her laugh across a crowded ballroom, unguarded and bright, and completely unlike anything else in that carefully composed room. He had chosen a bride once before, for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with duty and desperate necessity. This time, standing in a quiet orchard with the woman who had taught him that happiness and responsibility were never truly opposites, he chose again, and this time, he chose exactly right. They married 3 months later, in a small ceremony at Ashcombe attended by Edmund and Margaret Cole and a handful of close friends, far removed from the grand spectacle that had once been planned for a very different bride. Camilla sent a brief, gracious letter of congratulations, mentioning that she had recently begun an acquaintance with a viscount of considerable charm and even more considerable affection, news that brought Alistair genuine relief after everything that had passed between them. And on their wedding day, as Nora walked toward him beneath the ancient oak trees that lined the Ashcombe Gardens, laughing at something Margaret had whispered just before the ceremony began, Alistair found himself thinking that he had very nearly made the greatest mistake of his life. Choosing duty over happiness before a single unguarded laugh had shown him there was another way entirely, a way that required more courage than he had ever known he possessed, but offered, in return, a happiness he had never truly believed himself entitled to claim. In the weeks leading up to the ceremony, Nora had insisted on visiting the estate regularly, determined to understand every aspect of the life she was about to join, rather than simply arriving as a stranger to manage a household she knew nothing about. She walked the tenant farms with Edmund, learning the names of families who had worked the land for generations, and spent long afternoons reviewing account books with a careful attention that surprised even Alistair, who had not expected his future Duchess to take such genuine interest in the practical details of running an estate. "You needn't concern yourself with all of this," he told her one afternoon, finding her bent over a ledger in his study, comparing grain prices from the previous 3 harvests with a focus that reminded him, not for the first time, exactly why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. "I want to concern myself with it," she said, not looking up from the columns of figures. "I spent my entire life being told I had nothing meaningful to offer anyone. Alistair, I do not intend to become your wife and then contribute nothing beyond hosting dinners and choosing curtains. If I am to be Duchess of this estate, I intend to understand it thoroughly, tenants and accounts and all." He had smiled at that, crossing the room to press a kiss to the top of her head, marveling once again at how completely she had transformed his understanding of what a marriage could actually be, when built on genuine partnership rather than convenient arrangement. "Edmund tells me you have already suggested improvements to the Northern Farms irrigation that he had not considered himself. Edmund exaggerates my usefulness. Edmund does not exaggerate anything, ever, in the entire time I have known him. It is one of his most consistent qualities." Alistair had pulled a chair beside hers, and they had spent the remainder of that afternoon working through the accounts together, the beginning of a partnership that would define their marriage far more than any grand romantic gesture ever could. The morning of the wedding arrived clear and bright, unusually warm for the season, as though the weather itself had conspired to make the day as perfect as possible after everything that had nearly prevented it from happening at all. Alistair stood beneath the ancient oak trees lining the Ashcombe Gardens, dressed more simply than he had been for his aborted engagement to Camilla months earlier, and found himself unexpectedly nervous despite having faced considerably greater difficulties in the months since he had first heard Nora's laughter across a crowded ballroom. Edmund stood beside him, serving as witness alongside a small handful of trusted friends and neighbors who had come to know and respect Nora during the months of her regular visits to the estate. The tenant families had been invited as well, an unconventional choice that some of Alistair's more traditional acquaintances had quietly questioned, though he found he no longer cared much for opinions that valued tradition over genuine happiness. "Nervous, Your Grace?" Edmund asked quietly, watching him adjust his cravat for what must have been the 10th time in as many minutes. "Terrified, if I'm entirely honest. A healthy sign, I should think, for a man about to make the most important promise of his life." Edmund's weathered face creased into a rare, genuine smile. "Your grandfather married for love as well, you know, against his own father's wishes. I was only a boy at the time, but I remember the wedding clearly. He looked exactly as nervous as you do now." "I did not know that. There is a great deal about your family's history that gets forgotten over generations, Your Grace, particularly the parts that do not fit neatly into stories about duty and practical marriages. Your grandfather's happiness was real, and it lasted his entire life. I suspect yours will as well, if today is any indication of how thoroughly you have already learned the lesson it took me considerably longer to teach you." Before Alistair could respond, the small gathering fell quiet, and he turned to see Nora walking toward him beneath the dappled shade of the oak trees, dressed simply in pale gold rather than the elaborate silk that had once been chosen for a different bride entirely. She was laughing softly at something Margaret had whispered just before the ceremony began, and the sound of it, familiar now in every possible way, still managed to catch at something deep in his chest, exactly as it had the very first time he heard it across a crowded ballroom months earlier. She reached him beneath the trees, and as their eyes met, all the careful nervousness he had carried throughout the morning dissolved entirely, replaced by a certainty so complete it felt almost startling in its simplicity. This was exactly right. This had always, from that very first unguarded laugh, been exactly right. It had been worth every risk. It had been worth everything. A year had passed since the wedding beneath the oak trees, and Ashcombe had changed in ways that surprised even the tenants who had lived on the estate their entire lives. The northern bridge stood rebuilt in solid stone, sturdy enough to withstand another decade of spring floods without complaint. The east wing roof no longer leaked during autumn storms, and the farms that had once struggled beneath the weight of old debts now showed the first genuine signs of prosperity in longer than Edmund could easily remember. Nora sat in the small study that had once belonged entirely to Alistair, though it now bore unmistakable signs of her own presence. A second desk positioned near the window where morning light fell across account books she reviewed with the same careful attention she had shown from the very beginning of their partnership. She had taken to estate management with a natural talent that continued to surprise the tenant farmers, who had grown accustomed to bringing their concerns directly to the Duchess as often as to the Duke himself, trusting her practical judgment on matters ranging from crop rotation to the fair distribution of grain during difficult seasons. "You'll ruin your eyes, reading those figures in such poor light," Alistair said, entering the study to find her exactly where he had left her that morning, though the sun had shifted considerably since then. "The figures are more interesting than you might expect, Your Grace." She did not look up immediately, finishing whatever calculation currently held her attention before setting down her pen. "The southern orchard has produced nearly double what we harvested last year. I believe the new irrigation methods Edmund suggested have made a considerable difference. I trust your judgment on such matters entirely." He crossed the room and pressed a kiss to the top of her head, exactly as he had done countless times over the past year, a small gesture that had become as natural to him as breathing. "Though I did not come to discuss orchards. Edmund tells me a letter arrived this morning from Camilla." Nora's expression brightened with genuine pleasure. "What does she say?" "She and Lord Aldridge are engaged to be married in the autumn. She writes that he is considerably more inclined toward genuine affection than she initially expected from a man of his fortune, and that she finds herself, against all her own expectations, quite looking forward to the match." "I am glad for her, truly." Nora's voice carried none of the awkwardness that might have lingered between them, given how their own happiness had been built, in part, upon the ruins of Camilla's original engagement. She deserved considerably better than what either of us offered her during that difficult spring. She did, though I believe she has found it now, and rather sooner than either of us managed our own happiness. They had maintained a careful, gradually warming correspondence with Camilla over the past year, beginning with formal notes exchanged out of simple courtesy, and slowly developing into something that resembled genuine friendship, born from the shared understanding of exactly how narrowly all three of them had avoided a lifetime of quiet, practical misery. Lord Whitmore, too, had softened considerably in his opinion of the match once the estate's finances proved as stable as Edmund had promised, and he now visited Ashcombe several times each year, delighting in his role as an honorary grandfather to the young son Nora and Alistair had welcomed into the world just 4 months earlier. The boy, named Edmund after the steward who had done so much to save the estate during those difficult early months, currently slept in the nursery upstairs, watched over by a nurse whom Nora had personally selected from among the tenant families, insisting that the household staff reflect the same values of loyalty and genuine care that had come to define the entire estate under her influence. "Have you thought any further about the school?" Nora asked, returning to a conversation they had begun several weeks earlier, regarding a proposal to establish a small school for the tenant children, funded through the estate's now considerably healthier accounts. "I have. Edmund believes we can afford it comfortably, particularly once the coastal investments Camilla's father suggested begin returning proper dividends next year." Alistair settled into the chair beside her desk, the same chair he had occupied countless afternoons over the past year while they worked through estate matters together. "I confess I never imagined, during those difficult weeks before our wedding, that I would spend my evenings discussing school funding with such genuine enthusiasm. You never imagined a great many things, Your Grace, before I arrived to broaden your understanding of what a marriage could actually be." She said it with the same teasing warmth that had first caught his attention beside a garden pond years earlier, and he found himself laughing, easily and without restraint, exactly as he had learned to do so naturally in the years since. "No," he agreed, "I did not, though I have come to consider it the single greatest education of my entire life." Outside, the late afternoon light stretched long across the Ashcombe gardens, the same gardens where he had first found her discarded glove in the grass, where they had walked countless careful circuits around the pond, while pretending their growing affection was nothing more than pleasant conversation between strangers. The roses that had bloomed during that first uncertain spring now grew thick and abundant along the garden walls, tended by Nora's own careful hand during the rare quiet hours she managed to steal away from estate business and the demands of a growing family. Edmund the Elder found them there later that evening, still working companionably through the accounts as the light finally began to fade toward dusk, and he paused in the doorway for a long moment, watching them together with an expression of quiet, genuine satisfaction that neither of them noticed until he finally spoke. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace, but I wish to share some good news before the day ended entirely. The merchant family who purchased the coastal property has written to say the improvements they've made have increased its value considerably. They wish to know if we might be interested in selling additional acreage nearby, should any become available. Send word that we'll consider it," Alistair said, though carefully. "This time, we've learned the value of not rushing into arrangements without proper thought." "Indeed, Your Grace." Edmund's weathered face creased into the same rare smile he had shown on their wedding day, a full year earlier now, though it felt to Alistair as though considerably more time had passed. So completely had his life transformed since that difficult spring when duty and desire had seemed such impossible opposites. "If I may say so, Your Grace, watching this household find its footing over the past year has been among the greatest satisfactions of my entire career in service to your family. We could not have managed any of it without you, Edmund. You know that." "Perhaps not," Edmund allowed, with characteristic modesty, "though I believe the two of you would have found your way eventually, regardless of my small contributions. Some things, Your Grace, simply insist on happening, whatever obstacles duty or circumstance places in their path." He took his leave then, and Alistair and Nora sat together in the gathering dusk, the accounts finally set aside for the evening, listening to the distant sounds of the household settling into its familiar evening rhythms, servants preparing supper, their infant son beginning to stir in the nursery above, demanding attention with the particular insistence of a child who had inherited his mother's stubborn refusal to be quietly ignored. "We should see to him," Nora said, though she made no immediate move to rise, content for one more moment, in the comfortable quiet they had built together, so different from the careful, guarded conversations that had once defined their earliest meetings in gardens and libraries, where they had both pretended, for far too long, that duty alone could ever have been enough to satisfy either of them. In a moment, Alistair reached for her hand, exactly as he had done that first evening at Margaret Cole's cottage, when he had ridden an entire day simply to say the things he had been too afraid to say weeks earlier. "I find I am rather enjoying this particular moment, precisely as it is." She smiled at him, the same unguarded, honest smile that had first caught his attention across a crowded ballroom on the night he had already chosen a different bride entirely, before a single burst of genuine laughter had shown him exactly what he had been missing by living according to duty alone. He had been a duke who chose his bride for practical reasons, who believed happiness was a luxury unavailable to men of his station and responsibility. He had learned, through considerable difficulty and no small amount of risk, that the two were never truly opposed at all, that a life built on genuine partnership could satisfy both duty and desire in equal measure, if only a man possessed the courage to fight for it properly. Their son stirred again above them, his cries growing more insistent, and this time they rose together, still hand in hand, to attend to the newest addition to a family built not on convenient arrangement, but on the kind of laughter that had first caught a duke's attention across a silent ballroom, and had never once stopped changing everything about the life he thought he was destined to live. Upstairs, the nursery glowed warm with candlelight, and the young nurse rose from her chair with a grateful smile as they entered, handing the small, red-faced bundle over to Nora with practiced ease. The baby quieted almost immediately in his mother's arms, his cries settling into soft, contented murmurs as she carried him toward the window overlooking the same gardens where his parents' story had first begun. "He has your stubbornness already," Alistair observed, watching his son's small fist close tightly around one of Nora's fingers. "Edmund tells me he woke the entire East Wing at 3 this morning, simply because his blanket had been arranged slightly differently than he preferred. He has excellent taste in blankets, then. I see nothing stubborn about that at all." Nora's voice held the same warm humor that had first drawn Alistair to her years earlier, unchanged despite everything that had happened since, the marriage and the estate and the slow, steady work of building a life together from the ruins of one that had nearly gone very differently. "Besides, I understand his father was considerably more difficult as an infant, if Edmund's stories are to be believed." "Edmund exaggerates." "Edmund has never once exaggerated anything in the entire time I have known him. You've said so yourself, on more than one occasion." He laughed, unable to argue with his own words turned back against him so neatly, and crossed the nursery to stand beside her at the window, watching the last light fade slowly over the gardens below. Their son had fallen properly quiet now, his small eyes drooping toward sleep despite his earlier insistence on being heard. And for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply standing together in the gathering darkness, content in a way that neither of them had truly believed possible during those uncertain months when duty and desire had seemed such impossible opposites. "Do you ever think of that first night?" Nora asked quietly, still watching their son's peaceful face. "The engagement party, before any of this began?" "Often. I think of a laugh that cut through an entire silent ballroom, and how completely it changed the course of everything I believed my life was meant to be. I think of it too, though I confess I never imagined, hiding behind those ferns, that I was about to upend a duke's entire carefully planned existence simply by finding a footman's joke rather amusing. You upended considerably more than my plans, Nora. You upended everything I believed about what happiness required, and what a man of my station was permitted to want for himself." He pressed a kiss to her temple, their son sleeping soundly now between them. The whole of their small, hard-won family gathered together beneath the same roof that had once seemed destined for a very different future entirely. "I would not trade a single difficult moment of the past 2 years for the comfortable, dutiful life I once believed was the only path available to me." "Neither would I," she said softly. "Not for anything in this world." Below them, the garden settled into evening stillness, the roses she had planted with her own hands standing quiet and abundant along the walls, the pond where they had once walked careful circuits reflecting the last pale light of a day that had, like so many since their wedding, ended exactly as it should, with laughter, and honesty, and a happiness that neither duty nor circumstance had ever managed to diminish.